Hello, this is Melissa Hales Spencer, editor of the Altamont Enterprise, welcoming back Christopher Philippo. And Enterprise followers are familiar with Chris. You first met him through a letter to the editor. He's a man that puts together pieces of history, and this involves, among other things, old gravestones. I'm sure you'll remember he reunited the headstone of Robert Matthews with his son James. Robert's headstone had been a stoop of a barn in Guilderland, and James's had been edging a garden, I think, in Glenmont. And they're now side by side with the other headstones of the family members in Prospect Hill Cemetery. He also has been putting together his own history. He's adopted and became an activist for legislation on making the records, birth certificates, available to the people who were born. And that was passed by both houses. And has the governor signed that yet?
He hasn't signed it yet. It has not been delivered to him yet by the legislature. The sponsors of the bill had sent a letter to the governor kind of requesting that he request it from them. But that step hasn't been taken yet. There's so many bills, I guess, at the end of a session that need to be signed, that there does have to be some kind of order to it.
How frustrating for you.
It definitely is immensely frustrating to me and to others because, there are some rules regarding to how bills get sent over, but kind of when they're not in session, it's a little bit more of a little bit more opaque, I guess.
A labyrinth.
Yeah.
Well, what Chris is here today to talk to us about is town, village, municipal historians. It turns out that 2019 is a 100-year anniversary of what was the first law in the country, in New York, to have in each municipality, except I think in New York City, a designated historian. And I just looked up a little history, and we're going to learn a lot more. But it was signed by Governor Al Smith on April 11th in 1919. And the New York State historian at the time, James Sullivan, saw it as instrumental to help the Office of State History collect information on the Great War, on World War I. Supposed to be the war to end all wars, but we know better now. So Chris is both a volunteer for the New York State historian and also a trustee for, I think, two very different municipalities, Bethlehem and Lansingburg.
Well, to clarify a couple things, I had been a volunteer for New York State historian Bob Weibel, and the volunteer work that I did with him sort of wrapped up as he was finishing up there.
And when did he finish?
A few years ago, a couple of years ago now. Then there was acting state historian Jennifer Lemack, who I know, and then after him, Devin Lander. So
how long has Mr. Lander been in that post? Do you know?
Yep, he was appointed. I don't have all dates in my head. Let's see, May 2016 is when Devin Lander was.
So 3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and there are borough historians in New York City, and there's some community historians there.
And how did you get involved both in Bethlehem and in Lansingburg?
Here again, Lansingburg, I had been a trustee for a long time. I resigned kind of earlier this year and then joined the board of the Bethlehem Historical Association. I had lived in Lansingburg for a while.
And this is north in Troy, is that?
Yeah, the northern part of Troy.
Is this where Herman Melville's house is?
Correct.
Okay. I've been there because I have a friend who's a Melville scholar, and whenever he visits, we go around to the various sites. But
okay.
Yeah.
The Lansingburg Historical Society owns the Herman Melville house. And Lansingburg had been a independent village in town, but the city of Troy annexed the village of Lansingburg in 1901, and kind of the remainder of the town of Lansingburg was annexed by the town of Schaghticoke.
Oh.
So like from Pleasantdale up to the Deepkill, Grants Hollow.
So it just got subsumed by these larger...
Yeah.
But so that seems like it would make the Historical Society or historian even more important to keep a sense of identity for that place.
Right. The Lansingburg Historical Society was founded in 1965, I think, and at that time there were people that were still living that, were born in the village or the town and wanted to keep a memory of that alive. And at that time also, there was the demolition of the Lansing House in Lansingburg that got a lot of people
was that the
active.
founder of
Yeah,
that?
the founder.
Oh. Why was it demolished?
For a small grocery store which did not last very long.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and it was a house from 17th century or...
Oh, my. Yeah, lots of times it's when something we're about to lose makes people take note and
very true,
together.
And that's kind of true of the local government historian program, that the historians were concerned about the loss of records, particularly in wartime, when records can be lost. But I have several generations of ancestors in Lansingburg, so that's one of the things that made me interested in that. But I've been living in the town of Bethlehem for most of my life.
And that's got a really active historical society.
It does. Also founded in the 60s.
We had Susan Leith in to talk to us earlier. She's the town historian,
correct,
right?
Yep.
Yeah, and they're just doing so many. She was, at that time, promoting this tour they were doing, and I think they're doing it again very soon, where people were in historical garb to be the founding Slingerland's family, and then other people would, citizens, residents would come through and visit the burial site and the house, and it was just kind of an innovative way to literally make history come alive.
Right. She's done a number of interesting things. She has a kayak tour that she does even on the Hudson River. And there's a lot going on at the Bethlehem Historical Association. There's some painting and electrical work that's going to be done. We had gotten rid of the drop ceiling and kind of remodeling inside the schoolhouse that we own. And in connection with that, I can mention briefly, we recently acquired over 200 letters from that had been sent to Maria Becker of Becker's Corners in the town of Bethlehem, mostly from the 1850s and 1860s, from all over the state and some other parts of the country and Canada.
And who was she?
Well, a daughter of a prominent farmer of the area. The Becker house still stands in the Becker's Corners area. And she was a school teacher at the Cedar Hill schoolhouse that we own. And with the letters, we also acquired a daguerreotype of her.
Oh, neat.
And those came from a cellar in Maine, but we acquired from a cellar in Philadelphia 3 diaries by Maria Becker from the 1850s and 1860s. No idea how they got separated and went to different states, but we've kind of reunited them.
But how did you track them down? How did they come back to you?
I had, I'll occasionally do searches on eBay for, Bethlehem, New York, or, Becker's Corners, New York, or Cedar Hill, New York, things like that, just to get an idea of what types of items might be out there and what might be a good idea for us to try to acquire. So I had found the letters on eBay from one of those searches. I mentioned it to the president of the Historical Association, Karen Beck, and she thought that they sounded like a good thing for us to try to acquire, in particular because the seller had noted that there were a number of letters from Charles Rowley to Maria Becker. They were engaged, but they never married. That was a fact that the seller had found out from his own research. So they had corresponded like from 1858 to 1861. He had moved out to Warsaw, Indiana. He had a law practice, And he was referring to her as my wife, Maria, in his letters.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and there were 10 letters that were on eBay, and they were going to be relatively pricey, and they were all put on separate listings. So I got in touch with the seller to see if maybe he'd be willing to sell them as a batch. And that's when I learned from the seller that, no, actually there were over 100 letters, and he'd be willing to, let us buy the 10, I think, that he had put online for a certain price along with the daguerreotype. And he'd send on spec kind of the rest of the letters, just trusting us so that we could share them with the rest of the Board of Trustees to see if it was something we wanted to acquire. So when I actually inventoried the letters, it turned out there were over 200. So like twice what the seller had thought. A lot of them are.
Did you let the seller know this?
Well, I mean, he knew there was over 100.
Yeah.
And we did give him a good price. That
Can you reveal the price?
I don't remember the number offhand. I have a number of different numbers going around in my head because there was also the diaries that were acquired from a seller that was on Abe Books, the used book site. So, but.
Well, can you describe the physical letters, what they look like? I mean, some of the old handwriting just kind of gives you chills.
Yeah, I mean, it's cursive, which I guess they don't really teach so much anymore. I find most of them to be fairly readable. There's some words that I have to look at for a while, particularly some of the capital letters. Some of the writers had unusual ways of writing them.
And are they in envelopes at this stage?
Some of them are in envelopes. Some of them are folded up and not in envelopes. Most of the envelopes had the stamps removed from them by some collector, I guess, over the years. Some of the envelopes were actually sent through the mail. There's enough of the postmark left that you can tell that. Some of the envelopes seem to have been delivered in person. By, I don't know, passed on to a friend who was going to be heading to someone's house.
So the content of these letters, are they, a kind of like the everyday, yes, the sun is shining today, I went for a walk with my mother, or do they have like pieces of history, what we think of history?
Definitely pieces of history. That was a big part of why we thought that they would be
what are some of the things you've gleaned?
Well, there's a range of correspondence. Some of them are people that she had gone to school with. There's at least one letter from a former teacher of hers, at least one from a student of hers, immediate relatives, more distant relatives. There are a few letters from a cousin of hers from his regiment during the Civil War. Like he's writing her from, a steamer en route to points in the South or, at or near a fort or a camp that they're heading to. So that will definitely be of interest, like beyond the Bethlehem Historical Association, like the local Civil War Roundtable. I imagine will be interested in that. There does seem to be a fair amount of detail about family in the letters, like that we'll get a better picture of the size of these families and how they connect to other families. There are some funny things. There was a letter from one of Maria Becker's female friends where she said that she had recently been to the Hollow Church, the Queeman's Hollow Church, and that she had a headache afterwards, and she wasn't sure if it was the vociferous preaching that gave her the headache or if it was looking at all the gentlemen. And she writes, which do you think?
Oh God.
So there are cute things like that. There's some enclosures in the letters. There's printed wedding invitations, printed invitations to social clubs at music hall. There were some clippings from newspapers, like Charles Rowley, who had wanted to marry her, like he had clipped something about like the definitions of a husband and wife, or kind of what the benefit of, of having a wife is, or family.
Was there anything more romantic than that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. No, there definitely was. There was. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of letters from her in the collection. It's mostly letters that she received. But there are some drafts that she wrote.
Oh.
Yeah, and possibly some that are copies, maybe, of things that she had sent, handwritten copies.
But if you put side by side the letters she was receiving with the diary she was keeping, can you find out, like, interesting insights?
To some extent, yeah. There is an overlap with the diaries. The diaries are kind of, they're for 3 different years, and they're not all consecutive. And there were probably other diaries that she kept that weren't part of what the cellar had, but it will definitely fill in some pieces. And I even found online, like, somebody else had some letters of hers.
How fascinating! Just the diaspora of
they spread out, but we've kind of gathered them together.
Maine, Philadelphia, and now they're back and in the same schoolhouse where she taught. That's just really neat. That's such a beautiful schoolhouse. I went there for a tribal historian for the Mohegans, who I guess are now mostly located in Wisconsin, came and gave a presentation there. But it's just a beautiful structure, that schoolhouse. Yeah. But was this woman particularly prolific, or was this just typical of the time? We communicate now so differently, but I guess in the mid-1800s, the letter writing would have been the key way to stay in touch.
Yeah, that's tough to say. I don't feel qualified to say. I mean, she does seem to be fairly prolific. The fact that she was a school teacher, I guess, made her more of a literate sort of person, more interested in kind of reading and writing. And some of the letters, Rowley and Becker were writing to each other pretty frequently. I mean, almost like receive a letter, send a letter right back.
Doesn't it make you wonder what happened, why they didn't get married?
I don't entirely know. I get the impression that she was more inclined to stay in the area with her family and friends, that the idea of kind of moving out west maybe was something that she wasn't ready to do.
Because that was really a frontier then.
To some extent. I mean, Warsaw, Indiana, I don't think was particularly a big place. He did also work in Chicago for a while.
What did he do? He
was a lawyer, yeah. But while he was there and corresponding with her, she met Phil Miller from East Greenbush, and there's quite a few letters from him as well. And she ended
also romantic. I'm getting really interested in this woman.
More and more so over time. Yeah, and the two of them.
Did she ever marry at all?
She married Phil Miller.
Oh, she did.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there were. I think she had met Rowley kind of. Somewhere west of us, like in Tompkins County, I think, she had maybe a relative and he had a friend that was maybe one of her relatives, something like that.
So what is the Historical Society going to do with these letters?
Well, I got in touch with Jennifer Lamack, actually, for some advice about preservation.
And she was the one you said was the acting state historian.
She had been, right. And she put me in touch with somebody from the archives that's willing to give us some advice about preservation, because we don't have a collection quite like this, just a huge number of letters. Like, do we unfold the letters and keep them in an unfolded state, or do we leave them the way we found them? We definitely want to digitally scan or photograph all of them and transcribe them, and potentially that'll be a way that we'll be able to get members more involved, that we could share the scans of the letters and members could be a part of the project, that they could transcribe them and I think that would be nice. Like, members don't often have an opportunity to be involved in that kind of thing.
And plus, the big advantage is anyone can do research anywhere in the world on it. Then, once you post them online, once you scan them.
Right.
Yeah, and you don't have to worry about crumbling paper and all of that because...
Yeah, most of the paper is held up really well. Like older newspapers, I think it's probably a sort of pulp, not like the paper now. Only in a few cases are they sort of brittle. Only in a few cases has the writing become really faint. There were a couple interesting letters that were written in a way that I'd read about, but I hadn't actually seen. When the writer ran out of space on the piece of paper, they turned the paper 90 degrees and wrote additional lines that way. Sort of
I have some letters like that
writing.
from World War I from my grandfather, just because there was so shortage of paper, and you have to read them both ways.
So people back then would have been more experienced with that. Those are going to be a little more difficult, I think, for us to read.
Yeah.
Trying to puzzle out how they separate. And some of the handwriting is just exquisite and minute, too. Very, very tiny handwriting.
I find it just thrilling to hold. I went to a college that had the Barrett Browning love letter collection and also the door that they passed them through. And when you just hold those in your hand and you feel a connection to people that you wouldn't, I think, if you were just like reading them reprinted in a book somewhere or something.
I agree. I especially found it interesting with respect to some of the enclosures. Like one of the letters, one of the smallest envelopes actually had, a note in it and like a pledge to marry, like on a scrap of paper.
And this was to the man she didn't marry.
Well, it was a pledge by him to marry her,
right.
Who she didn't marry, right? And there were little torn bits of newspaper in which little items were wrapped up. Like one of them, as I unfolded it, there was a pressed flower there. And another one, when I unwrapped it, there were 3 differently colored bits of cellophane, like little dots.
And you have no idea what it means.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was like some kind of confetti from a celebration, or I don't know.
Yeah, it makes me think of little things I've tucked away. You just wonder what people would think in a later generation. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into one collection. I also want to kind of, pump your brain on the larger history of historians.
I did make some notes about kind of
go ahead.
The history of...
Enlighten us.
Yeah. Like 1790 is when the first historical society was founded in the United States, in Massachusetts. And it had sort of a broad interest in history. So they did collect things beyond just Massachusetts.
And the history of our country was so very young then that,
right.
Yeah.
The New York Historical Society founded in 1805. And I mentioned the dates, like not so people try to remember them, but just to show kind of the range of time, I guess.
Yeah. And do you know what the impetus was in 1805? Why suddenly people thought...
Well, I mean, I think part of it was kind of they looked at the founding in the other state of a historical society and said, well, New York really
Massachusetts
needs to have one
can do
of
this,
its,
so
exactly.
can we. Okay.
Yeah. 1818 is when the New York State Library was founded. 1836, the New York State Museum. 1862, the Bureau of Military Record. This was something in Albany where, as from the title, they were collecting military records, but they were also collecting military relics, which they would put on display in Albany. So it was sort of a military-themed museum and library. 1895...
Wait, do the relics from that still exist?
I think maybe some of them may have, but there was a problem, of course, of the Capitol fire in 1911, in which so much was lost, because at that time the The library was in the Capitol building, and they had museum items in the Capitol as well. 1895 is when the first law for a New York State historian was passed, and let's see, Hugh Hastings was the first New York State historian, and he was actually a journalist, not a historian.
Well, journalism is the first take of history.
Right.
So, yeah.
I thought there's a quote I have I thought that you might find interesting.
Yeah.
And this is actually from 1866 with respect to the Bureau of Military Record. And they note that of newspapers as an element of history, Mr. Greeley, in his American Conflict, justly says, "Today, the history of our country is found recorded in her journals more fully, promptly, vividly than elsewhere. A history which takes no account of what was said by the press in memorable emergencies befits an earlier age than ours."
Horace Greeley, go. That's great.
Yeah. So there was some thought to a historical museum, 1869, merging it with the Bureau of Military Record, and they were talking about possibly having a state historian at that time, 1869, but for whatever reason, no bill with respect to that had passed. So 1895 is when the first state historian was created, and he was interested in collecting records and getting them published. He had an office in one of the towers, at the top of one of the towers of the Capitol building.
Nice perch.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken Capitol tours. Those towers are not part of the tour, at least not any tour that I had taken, unfortunately. And Hugh Hastings, who was the first New York State historian, in 1897, he had come up with the idea for regimental recorders. In looking at military records, he was dissatisfied by the quality of some of them and the absence of some of the records. So what he wanted to do was have non-combatants in military companies who would be recording all the information about what was going on and sending them back. And that idea was not actually implemented. Like, he got a lot of feedback from generals, some positive and some negative, kind of like the idea of embedded journalists, I guess, in a way that we had in the Gulf War. Around the same time, Brooklyn had a state law passed for there to be a Brooklyn historian who actively went around, had a good budget for going around and collecting records about the history of Brooklyn. So the idea of a local historian is something that predates the 1919 law. It was something that was essentially percolating for a while. One of the interesting things about the state historian, for a while, New York State had, as it does now, a blue flag, and then for a few years it turned to a buff-colored background on the flag, like a light yellow color. But then the state historian himself was active in getting it turned back to blue.
Do we know why it went to buff intermittently?
Well,
Who makes those decisions on the state flag?
New York had, of course, used both colors, the blue and the buff. Like the state historical markers were kind of described as that, even though the yellow on the historical markers I would describe as brighter and maybe a little darker than buff. But they were the colors of some of the uniforms, I guess, in the Revolutionary War New York regiments.
I never knew that.
I'm not sure exactly why they changed it to buff, but kind of the reasoning about changing it back was that kind of the buff quickly would fade from the light yellow to white, and white is associated with surrender, a yellow color or white color was associated with plague flags, things like that. So there were bad associations, he felt, and was more interested in going back to the original color. So 1895, again, was when the state historian's office was created, and he was given the task of gathering official records, memoranda, and data relating to colonial wars, the War of the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the War of the Rebellion, together with all official correspondence of a diplomatic character between this Commonwealth and other colonies. So the state historian's office has always been strongly associated with military records, even though it's not specific to that.
Yeah, and I read that James Sullivan, in pushing for the 100-year-old law, was interested in, collecting the military service of the people in World War I. But that's why I thought what you were talking about much earlier about the school teacher with her letters is so much of history traditionally in this country has been about wars and that kind of history. And there's this whole other side. I tend to, unfortunately, think of it as male and female history, the wars and the dates and those kinds of things versus what's happening culturally, and it seems like they're both very important.
Right. Well, the 1919 law creating the local government historians went along with another law passed the same year for collecting the history of the war. And they were interested not just in the military records. I mean, there was certainly a lot of emphasis on that. But they were interested in what was being done on the home front also. So Red
As part
Cross
of the war
records,
effort, the support.
Things like that. So it wasn't limited to war. And I have a theory that the women obtaining suffrage around the same time may have influenced in some degree the idea for local historians, because a lot of the earliest local government historians were women. Probably a lot of them coming out of the DAR, because local DAR chapters would have someone designated as a historian of the chapter. And I know at least some of those early historians were women from the DAR. And they were involved in a lot of projects that the state historian was interested in over the years. Like, again, turning back the clock to 1912, there was a law passed that the state, like any abandoned cemeteries, I guess, in the state, like if they were going to be moving them, as sometimes happens, like with Albany Rural Cemetery, there was all the cemeteries that had been in what's now Washington Park that were moved out to Albany Rural Cemetery. There was a law where people should report transcriptions, from gravestones to the state historian. And it was never much followed. That was something that the state historian wrote town clerks and village clerks trying to get them to send him that information. And he went even kind of beyond the law and said, like, could you do this for all of the cemeteries, like not just sort of abandoned ones? And can you also tell me what kind of local history records you have? And he got just, hardly any responses to this letter. So I think there were a number of little attempts like that where the state historian was trying to get information about local history and wasn't really succeeding at it. And so with the 1919 law, where there was a requirement that the local historians report to the state historian, they were hoping that would be a little more successful than some of those earlier attempts, like in sending just cemetery records. And I had gotten involved in looking at the local government historian's annual reports to the state historian in a sort of roundabout way. A number of years ago, I had tried applying for a job as a village and town historian in Mayfield, New York, I had seen a listing on monster.com and was like, yeah, that would be a really interesting job. Like, it was just a part-time job that would really not pay very much.
Yeah, I sense a lot of the people in our area, the historians, do it as a labor of love.
Yeah, a lot of them, they don't get paid anything, or it's just sort of a very small amount, or maybe they're given a very small amount for an office budget. It's rare that, even though it is you are a village or town official, but no, it's just not a living wage that any of them get. And as a consequence, a lot of the people are retired people that get involved as municipal historians. But in the course of trying to figure out beyond what the job listing said about what a village and town historian does, I did a little research. I found the law itself, some information on the New York State Museum website.
Yes, and you pointed me to that, and I can just read what the law says the duties are: research and writing, teaching and public presentations, historic preservation, organization, advocacy, and tourism promotion. So it's kind of a broad umbrella there. And
yeah, very broad. And there's only a few specific responsibilities that are mentioned in the law. Most of them are sort of general. Like, one of the things that was mentioned, involvement in historical markers, making sure that records are safe, in fireproof kind of areas. So I did not actually get the job as the village and town historian. The wife of a former village president got the job.
I think that happens a lot. There's political influence in these appointments.
I did get interviewed by some of the people there, so I got that far at least. But, I had gotten more interested. Okay, well, what are these annual reports? I hadn't actually seen one. So I wrote the New York State Library to see if, I could look at them there. And they said, oh, well, they're actually in the office of the state historian, so you have to get in touch with him. They're not publicly available. So I got in touch with the state historian, Bob Weibel, at that time, and he said, yeah, I can make an appointment to meet with you so that you can look at some of those annual reports. And he said something about them, they're not all necessarily in order or whatever. And I said, well, I have some time to volunteer. I've volunteered for the library before. So when I met him, he had a volunteer coordinator with him, and they were in file cabinets kind of in a windowless basement room, along with some of the chartering records. Historical Society has to send in reports to New York State Museum chartering. And they were alphabetized, but he said more recent records had not been collated with the older ones. And as I started looking at the folders, some of the municipalities had empty folders, and I didn't find any folders really that had records going back much further than the 1970s. There were some 60s ones, but relatively rare. And earlier than that, only occasionally some correspondence, but not the reports. There might be a note that somebody had been appointed to the office. So it turns out at some point, a lot of the older annual reports at the state historian's office sort of disappeared, and it's not known exactly what happened to them. The history of the state historian's office is sort of a complicated one with more politics involved than you would think. Originally, it was the governor that would appoint the state historian, but in 1911, there was a powerful commissioner of education, Andrew Draper, and he took the state historian's office. He got a bill put into the legislature that would bring the state historian into the Department of Education.
Is that where it is today?
It is under NYSED, yeah. And then that bill that Draper passed was kind of pushing away the state historian's own bill that would have created actually a sort of a local historian network at that time in 1911. And he was quite irked about that. So personality conflicts, you also have the fire around that time. And Victor Hugo Palseats, he was the state historian at that time. Like, he was very disturbed about the condition of records in many places.
Well, so just to go back to that with these missing records, where today in this modern computer era, are they now digital, the annual reports?
No, they haven't been digitized. Like, I was involved in kind of collating the more recent records with the older ones. And over the course of the time that I was volunteering there, like, occasionally boxes would show up from who knows where of some other relevant records.
But are the historians still filing these annual reports today?
They are, yeah.
And they're filing them on paper, not on...
Oh, there is the option now, and I believe they prefer it of doing it through the website.
It seems like going forward, that would make the job much easier.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, the compliance was really varied over the years because often the municipalities, they don't know that they're supposed to appoint a historian, or they do know they're supposed to appoint a historian, but they don't know what the historian does, and they don't know even that it's a state law. Like, they just sort of keep appointing a local historian because they think that's what local government does, but it's actually a state law.
Yeah, well, that's why I wanted to do this podcast, so people would be aware. In our coverage area, it seems almost entirely up to the individual historian. They do so many different kinds of things with it. It depends.
There's a lot of freedom in it. Yeah. The state historian is supposed to annually give the local historian some idea of a project to work on. In earlier years, there were forms that would be sent to the local historians with a number of questions on it, asking them if they did certain things or encouraging them to do certain things. And during that time period, one of the most prominent people to be a local government historian was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the town historian for Hyde Park.
Lucky Hyde Park.
Yeah. So those, thankfully, his reports were pulled out at some point and put in a separate Roosevelt collection.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
So I was able to look at those. But other early records, like, there's that whole 1919, almost like up into the 1970s, where they don't have very much. At the state historian's office. It just seems like
such a cruel irony that the people that are the keepers of history can't have their own history, doesn't it? I mean,
it is. I found it sad, and I was hoping, kind of, as the 1919 the anniversary came up this year, that maybe something would be done to see, like, well, county historians, like, do some of them have some of those older reports, maybe from the, or at the town level or the village level? Do they, because presumably they would keep one copy for themselves and send one copy to the state historian. But, even at the local level, I suspect that happens too. Like, records vanish, when a new historian comes in, the old historian doesn't necessarily turn the records over. They do most of the time, but there are problems that happen sometimes where that doesn't happen.
Well, one of the sites you had pointed me to, it was, and because we're running out of time, I just kind of wanted to close out with your thoughts on this. It was the Association of Public Historians of New York State, and they had on there a presentation that the state historian had given recently, David Lander, and it just, so many people, I think, don't think of history as important. And he had isolated these 7 ways that history is essential. I'm just going to not do his, background on it, but just the topics, and see if you have any kind of closing thoughts on this. Because one is identity, he said, that it enables people to discover their own place in the stories of their community. The second is critical skills, that it teaches independent thinking, and he had this whole, explanation of that. The third is it adds vitality to places where you live and work. The fourth was economic development. Then engaged citizens, which is something I think we're desperately in need of these days myself. The sixth was leadership, because it can inspire local leaders. And the seventh was legacy, that history saved and preserved is crucial to preserving democracy for the future by explaining our shared past. And all those elements that I feel are so important often just get brushed aside in a kind of modern culture that we live in. I don't know if you have closing thoughts on the value of history, because you seem to be a man that spent a lot of time, energy, brain power in looking at history.
Yeah, Victor Hugo Palseat's kind of, when he was the state historian, when he was looking at kind of records that were destroyed, he felt that often the government officials were concerned mainly with the utility of paperwork for whatever is happening now, and anything like in the past is past. You don't need to worry about it anymore. It's just taking up space. Get rid of it. But like James Sullivan, whose ideas were very similar, and who was the historian when the local government historian program was created, he associated local history very strongly with patriotism, and that sense of place, I think, that kind of knowledge about the history of the place that you're living will make you a better citizen, both locally and nationally. And he was concerned a lot with kind of the fluidity of population, that kind of people were not living their whole lives in the same town that they were born in anymore, and that it would take education to help people moving from other communities, whether they're just moving from one town over or from across the state or from abroad, that they really needed to be taught about the history of the place that they're in, so that they care about the place that they're in, so that they care about the country at large. And I think there's something to that. I think to some extent he took it to some extremes, but he definitely had great ambitions for the idea of the local historian program, and was really hoping that kind of it would help the Office of State History sort of become a clearinghouse for local history, and in turn help create better local state history education in the schools. And that hasn't quite happened. There isn't a smooth line of communication from local historian to state historian to education.
Again, it seems so up to the individual. When I was a school child in Guilderland here, Arthur Gregg was the Guilderland town historian, and I remember him as a snowy-haired, white-haired old man that would come in, and he would tell us about Guilderland history. And I was a kid that played in the Hunger Kill and had found these pieces of glass, and here I learned there was a glassworks there, in the 1700s. But it just seems to be up to the individual local historian. There's no sense of having it, New York education is so driven from the top down. Yeah. It doesn't seem to have reached out across.
There's more work to be done there.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the challenges is that it's an unfunded mandate, a state law. There's no state funds that are given to local government historians. There's no, little money available to them at the municipal level. So it requires really passionate people in the job. And unfortunately, there often have been some very passionate people. Occasionally, I had seen some of the annual reports where the local historian wrote, I didn't do anything this year because I'm not paid anything. It's like, well, why don't you let somebody else have that job,
I know. Well, one thing, too, another 100-year anniversary that I discovered is there was a journal that was formed 100 years ago with a different name, but now, this past summer, they put out the Cornell University Press got together with the New York State Museum, and they put together an actual printed journal with a lot of interesting topics. So maybe that's one good thing going forward that people can read and think about, at least. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean the state historian does have a webpage on the New York State Museum's website, and has kind of updates there. And some of the local historians do have on their municipal websites, they have their own pages in some municipalities, not all of them.
So give us, for our final closeout thought, why it matters, why local history matters.
Oh, boy. Gosh, that's kind of hard. I mean, I was brought up in a way that I always cared about it because my parents kind of were taking my brother and I to museums and historic houses. I think it matters in part because it does help you be more involved in your community. Like if there's opportunities for people to volunteer, either as a municipal historian or with a local historical society. And those are definitely things to encourage young people to get involved with. There used to be in the past, the New York State Historical Association, they had something called the Yorkers, which was...
I was a member of the Yorker Club.
Okay, great.
In high school, yes.
Yeah. It was sort of a statewide network where they would have clubs at middle schools and high schools, I think.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And there was a journal for them published, and something happened and it just went away. I think there might be some local chapters that still exist just without the statewide support, but I'd love to see something like that come back. And I had actually written a proposal to state historian Bob Weibel that there were so many local government historian offices where nobody had been appointed, and I thought that something that they could try doing would be to have like a exceptional student, in that community, like somebody's really good at history in their high school, give them the opportunity to be the local government historian. And that's something that would help that student also, on an application to college or something. Like they could say, this is something that I've done, or help build a resume for them. Because, I mean, when the job is one that generally doesn't pay, either retirees are going to often take it, but students, there would be room for them to take it too. So
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
We'll close out on that, and thank you for sharing all of this.
Oh, well, thank you.